Hey, what's going on? My name's Vit, and in this video, we're going to be talking all about tanking. Now, just the other day, I was running through Vanaspati, a level 86 dungeon from Endwalker, and, you know, I was tanking all the mobs, I was tanking the bosses, it was all good fun, except I was on Dragoon. The tank was, I assume, new to tanking. They had their tank stance on, but they didn't really have up-to-date gear, and they must not have been doing very much damage because me and the Bard just kept stealing aggro from them on just about every pack of mobs. They kept dying to the bosses and getting rezzed and not picking up aggro on the bosses, so that left us to tank the bosses as well. That poor healer somehow managed to carry us through. Me and the Bard were having fun chugging hyper potions the entire time to stay alive. We were laughing about that, and it was just a fun experience. But I got out of that dungeon and realized I should probably make a tank guide. So here we are. So in this video, we're just going to kind of go over everything that you need to know if you're new to tanking. If you've done some tanking, there will be some more advanced stuff in here as well that might help you out that you might not have known about. But I know tanking can be stressful for new players. A lot of people have anxiety about tanking, but it's really not so bad. Tank is actually one of the easier jobs in the game, or easier roles in the game, in my opinion. You do have a bit more responsibility than DPS or healer a lot of the time, but it's not so bad once you get the hang of it, and we're going to show you how to do that in this video. So like I had just mentioned with that tank in the dungeon that I ran the other day, they were a little under-geared. So the first thing you really want to look at on tank is making sure that your gear is up to date as you are leveling. You don't have to go crazy with this, but just make sure that your gear level is roughly in the range of the dungeons that you're running. So if you're running an 86 dungeon, make sure your gear is somewhere around there. If it's at like 83 or 80, it's probably a little too low. You can kind of make up for it if you're playing really well. But if you're new to the game and still learning, you can really use all the help you get. You'll take less damage from all of the mobs and the bosses. The healer will have an easier time healing you if you have better gear, and it just makes everybody's life a little easier. Also makes it a little less likely that the DPS will steal aggro from you. If you're super under-geared, even with your tank stance on, the DPS, if they're over-geared and playing well, they can very easily steal aggro from a tank. So managing aggro on a tank is really not that difficult. You basically just AOE the mobs in the dungeons, but like I said, if you're under-geared, it can cause some problems. So just a quick note to stay up to date with your gear as you're leveling and once you reach max level, because it is more important on tank than any of the other roles. Alright, the next piece of advice that I would offer to new tanks would be to use the duty support. Now, this isn't great long term, but when you're just learning how to tank, learning your rotation, learning your toolkit, you can come in here and run any dungeon in the game, at least any of the main story dungeons, with a party of NPCs. Now, I say this isn't great because these NPCs do not play like real players, and this can teach you some bad habits. Particularly the healers are maybe a little slow at healing. The DPS are incredibly slow with their damage. They often single target things down instead of AoEing all of the mobs. So the dungeon pulls go super slow. The healers tend to just not keep up if you pull ahead. But if you go pack by pack in here, you can kind of pull a bunch of mobs and learn the ropes of tanking at least. But when you play with real players, just know that you can typically go a little faster than you can with these guys. I'm going to hop into one. I'm actually going to swap to Warrior. Just because it has a little more self-sustain, and spoiler alert, this is not going to go well. That's Trust, that's the wrong thing. Trusts are another version of duty support, but it was added beforehand, so this is the more current version with the duty support. This covers all of the expansions, so even if you're still in A Realm Reborn, you can come in here and do all of the dungeons through this. But like I said, you'll want to be playing with real players eventually. It'll speed things up. and you'll just have a better time overall, because you'll see that the healer just really doesn't keep up a lot, and they just kind of struggle to do any damage when you pull the mobs. So gonna remember to turn my tank stance on and pop sprint. And this is one of the most notorious pulls in the game. It's a massive pull, but we're not even gonna do the whole thing. We're just gonna grab a few here, and I probably won't even survive that, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Pick these guys up and keep moving. It looks like they have taken aggro on one of the mobs because they're probably just single targeting it. So, gonna mitigate, I'm gonna shield myself. It's not going so badly this time. Kind of struggling, gonna heal myself. See how far we can get here. Alphino is struggling to keep up. Gonna invuln. I was getting a little low there. I'm surviving. He pulled through. Gonna raw intuition. Keep my health up. Back to full. So warrior is nice because you can actually survive a lot of this stuff. We're gonna put a slow on everybody. I did try this before this take, and it did not go quite this well. I'm having to use all of my mitigation. I'm struggling on health. Gonna hyper potion. That's another pro tip. Hyper potions are your friend. Raw intuition's back up, so I can heal myself at least a little bit. And with the power of warrior, we are able to get through this for the most part. It's way more difficult than it needs to be. I would not expect a new tank to be able to survive this quite as well as I am. And even so, I'm on the verge of death here, having to use literally every toolkit or every tool in my kit that's available to me. And as you can see, this is taking way longer than it should. All of my long cooldowns are coming back off cooldown, and this is just not the way to play this game. But I am having to use everything to its fullest potential. It's giving me a great way to get familiar with tanking. But like I said, that is not how this works when you're playing with real players. That pull was way more stressful. I only did about half the pull too. I could have kept going and I would have certainly died. But I stopped kind of short, and you know, Alphino was able to catch up. But if you pull too much in these duty support dungeons with the NPCs, they can get a little lost and lag behind. As you can see, they're not exactly the most responsive, but I was having to do way too much work there just to stay alive. But like I said, obviously you can just pull a single pack and have no problem, at least to familiarize yourself with your toolkit. Okay, next up, I just want to briefly cover some of the basic tank toolkit. A lot of the tanks share a lot of this stuff. Some of it has different names, but and then some of the tanks have different types of tools like heals, shields, or mitigation. That varies from tank to tank, but it all works roughly in a similar way. Mitigation reduces incoming damage. Shields basically give you a overshield or more effective HP. And then you have heals, which are pretty obvious. They just heal you up after you've taken damage. So it just really comes down to figuring out when to use each tool most effectively within whatever you're doing, whether that's a boss fight or in a dungeon. The tanks do play quite differently from one another when it comes to how their mitigations and healing and shielding works. But it's all pretty easy to figure out. Just read through your tooltips as you level, and should be pretty self-explanatory. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but I do want to touch on some of the other role actions, as well as just some more tank-specific stuff. So obviously all the tanks also have an invuln. We can talk about that a little bit later, but they all vary slightly as well, and figuring out when to use it can vary between the tanks. If you're not communicating with your healer, it can be kind of interesting trying to use this effectively. A lot of the time the healer will just keep healing you even though you're invuln, and it will be pretty useless. But if they're smart, if they're a good healer and they notice that you have invulned, they will make good use of it. You also have your interject and low blow. All of the tanks share these abilities. Interject will let you interrupt a flashing cast bar on an enemy. So when they're casting an ability and it's flashing, you can interrupt it with interject. That's an interrupt. And then low blow is a stun. You're able to stun mobs. This does not work on most bosses, but for any dungeon mobs, you can typically interrupt their AoEs. Like if you see a ground AoE, you can stun them out of it and it'll cancel that attack typically. Some things can't be stunned, but you can also use this as a very slight mitigation. If an enemy's attacking you, you can stun them for a few seconds and they won't be able to get any attacks out. Then you have your arm's length, which is your anti-knockback. So if an ability is going to knock you back, you can press this and you will not be knocked back. But in addition to that, it also applies an effect to you where when you are hit, it applies a slow to the mobs attacking you. So it applies a 20% slow, which basically makes this work like a mitigation. It basically slows down the mobs auto attacking you for 20%, making you take less damage. Super useful in dungeons. In raids and stuff, you basically just want to save it for that anti-knockback, but it's good in dungeons. Shirk is an ability that lets you pass off your aggro to your co-tank. You never really want to use it on anybody but a co-tank in raids if you're doing like a tank swap. We'll come back to that a bit later. You can basically ignore this if you're running any dungeons or really low-level stuff. This is more of a raiding button. And then you have provoke and your ranged attack. All the ranged attacks are called something different on all the various tanks, but they all have one. And these can both be used for pulling bosses, pulling mobs, grabbing aggro on different enemies. And we'll come back to that when we get to talking about actually pulling mobs. But both of those are really useful tools. And then of course you have your tank stance, which you just need to turn on at the start of a dungeon. If you forget to turn this on, you'll run into some problems where everybody else will be pulling aggro. So just turn that on in a dungeon. If you are in a raid with a co-tank, it's usually common practice whoever turns theirs on first is the main tank. We'll talk about that a little bit more shortly, but only the main tank really needs that on unless there's some type of tank swap coming up or so on. But again, we'll get back to that. And then again, you just have all your mitigations, your heals, and your shields. So that about covers the entire tank toolkit. Their DPS rotations are generally pretty simple, especially compared to the DPS in the game. It's much easier to play a tank and do damage. You just really have to figure out where to use all of your other tools, as well as things like positioning the boss and potentially tank swaps and so on in raid. But when it comes to dungeons, you just pull the mobs, mitigate, and do some damage. It's really not that hard. But optimizing when to use what is the part that takes some practice. So one other real quick thing that I want to talk about before we get into all of the tank-specific stuff is the concept of uptime in this game. You have your GCD, which all of your buttons are on, all of your main combo actions. So as you can see down here, when I press a button, that circle that spins around, that is your GCD timer, or your global cooldown. So to do the most amount of damage that you possibly can, you want to keep that rolling smoothly. You may have heard this referred to as always be casting. Basically just always be casting an ability, have that rolling smoothly whenever you're in combat. And you're able to weave in your off global cooldowns in between that GCD timer. So this is pretty much the basics of how to do damage in this game. You basically just go through doing your combos, and then in between them, you can press all of your other abilities that are not on that timer. And this will just make for the optimal damage that you can do. If that timer ever hangs up or doesn't rotate smoothly, just know that it's not a huge deal, but you could be playing better, to put it simply. Like I said, not a big deal, but it's just something to be aware of, especially when you're focused on tanking and, you know, you're looking at pulling mobs, running around. You could be using your ranged attack if you're running ahead of the mobs and you're not able to hit them. You could just keep that ranged attack rolling. You could keep the AOE going if you're in range of them. And, you know, while you're trying to get all your mitigation out and everything, try to just do it in between your main combos, whether that's AOE or single target. And that will just set you off on a much better foot than somebody who's not paying any attention to that. Because that really is the basics of how to do your rotation and just how to do damage in this game for any job. But as a tank, you can get lost in the weeds a bit trying to mitigate and pull mobs and position bosses. And, you know, it can be easier to drop that GCD uptime. But if you're really aware of this and focus on keeping it rolling smoothly, it can take you really far. So just something to think about and something I thought I'd mention. Okay, so this is the last thing that I want to talk about real quick before we get into the actual specifics of how to play tank. I promise some tank content is coming up shortly. But the thing is, I wanted to bring up just tank etiquette in general. There's a big thing that happens in a lot of dungeons where maybe the tank is newer or they just want to take things a little slower. And they don't pull as many mobs as they could, and maybe a DPS or a healer goes ahead and pulls some extra mobs for them, maybe unintentionally, maybe intentionally, but I've seen tanks get very upset about this, and some of them throw a temper tantrum and just say, hey, you pull it, you tank it, and that is not good to do. This is going to happen to you. A DPS or a healer will pull mobs at some point when you're tanking, and it's your job as the tank to hold aggro on those mobs. Even if you didn't want to initially, it's still your job. If those mobs are attacking the party, it's your job as a tank to pick them up. If you don't do that, you are not playing your role. It's as simple as that. If you tell people that, hey, I'm new, I want to take things a little slow, and they don't respect that, then that's on them. And, you know, you can have a problem at that point. But if, you know, if you say that, most people will be cool. Most people will see if you're new, if you have a sprout above your head, or if you're viewing the cutscene when you queue into a dungeon. Most people will be chill if you just pull a few mobs. If you pull like one pack of mobs, a lot of the time the healer won't even have to heal you, and they'll just be kind of standing there like, okay, let's, you know, move along a little quicker. But just be aware. That's, again, this is why I recommend those duty supports, so that you can go in there, kind of get a feel for it, and get comfortable at least pulling a couple packs of mobs and see where you end up. Again, duty support is going to be hard mode when it comes to pulling more mobs. The healers in this game are super overpowered. They can keep up with you. But again, it's just your job to pick up mobs if somebody grabs one by accident, on purpose. Don't take it to heart. If a tank is getting upset with that, if you're upset about it, if you're upset about a healer pulling extra mobs, just leave the dungeon, queue in again. They'll find a new tank that will hold aggro on the mobs, and they'll go about their day. So I don't want to stress people out, but it is your job as a tank to tank. So just be aware when you go into a dungeon, it's going to happen. And if it does, don't be alarmed and just pick up the mobs. And the healers or the DPS typically will be doing so with the understanding that you'll be fine. Especially if it's a healer doing it, just trust them, let them pull the extra mobs and pick them up. as quickly as you can, and, you know, maybe the next pull, try to grab an extra pack. So that's all I'll say about that, but never say you pull it, you tank it, because that is one of the dumbest things that I hear out of tanks in this game. Like, if a tank is just refusing to play the game because I pulled an extra mob as a DPS, it's like, all right, get over it. Let's just play the game. Let's get through this dungeon. I just want to be done with this quickly. And again, I don't expect new players to speedrun everything. Nobody does. But you'll get some toxic people, and it's just take it as it comes. Don't take it too seriously. I would always rather see a new tank try to push the limits, and if we wipe, we wipe. It's less painful than going one pack at a time most of the time. I'd rather just reset and try again, maybe take it a little slower the next time, but I'd rather see new tanks going for it and trying it and, you know, trying to push those limits. So don't be afraid to, and, you know, just see where your limits are. It can be fun. So, but take it slow if you want. It's up to you at the end of the day. All right, so we're in a dungeon here, and I just want to talk about picking up mobs. I'm in here unsynced at level 90. This is a level 70 something dungeon, so I'm just going to kind of blast through mobs and not take any damage. So I'm in here by myself, but I just want to show how I kind of go about picking up mobs. The easiest way to do this is just with your basic AOE combo. As long as you have your tank stance on, you can just walk up and hit them with AOEs, and you will grab aggro on the mobs. But I like to do it a slightly fancier way, where I use my ranged attack as well as provoke, and then go into my AoE combo. So I kind of run up, ranged attack one, swap to another, provoke one, and then that makes it easier to pick up the rest with a single AoE as you're already sprinting past them. Another quick tip is that if you sprint outside of combat, you get a 20-second sprint. If you sprint after you're already in combat, after you've already run into the mobs, it's only a 10-second sprint. So you want to sprint before you get to the mobs so that you can keep sprinting for the entire duration of the pull. So you can kind of outrange some of the auto attacks as well as you're running. If you're not sprinting, you might not be able to do that. But I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to run in, grab a couple mobs with my ranged attack as well as provoke. Already target one, swap to another, provoke, get an auto attack, keeping full GCD uptime with my ranged ability as we run. You can gap close if you want. It's optimal to put that under buffs, but you know, during a dungeon it doesn't always matter. And then at this point you would just stop, mitigate, and start using your burst to blast down all these mobs. So pretty simple. Like I said, you don't have to do it quite as fancy as I do with the provoke and the ranged attack. You can kind of just walk up, hit your AoE, and it'll pick up aggro. If you hit them a couple times, that should be more than enough to grab aggro on any mobs. And as long as your tank stance is on, your DPS and healer will not take aggro from you. One thing to look out for is on the enemy list. When there's more mobs, there will be more enemies here. But as long as they have this little red circle... Oh, I went to the wrong side. As long as this little red circle is here, that means that the enemy has aggro on you. If this turns yellow, it means you're about to lose aggro, or you're about to gain aggro if you're a DPS or something. But if this is green, it means that the mob is not focused on you and you need to go pick those up. So the enemy list is super important to look at when it comes to determining whether or not you have aggro. But that's just really one thing to look out for when you are tanking, especially in dungeons. If you might have missed a mob, if a DPS pulled something extra that they shouldn't have, just looking at your enemy list will be a very clear indicator of what's going on with the different mobs. The next thing I want to talk about is tank cooldowns and when to use them in dungeons. This is different for raids, of course, but in dungeons, the pulls are usually pretty formulaic in the sense of how long they take. Obviously, this can vary a little bit if you have some DPS that are maybe killing things a little slower, or if you were not pulling as many mobs as you could, it could spread things out in a weird way as well. But it typically lines up where you'll have a cooldown for pretty much everything throughout the dungeon. You never want to use all of your cooldowns all at once, because then you'll obviously not have anything for the next pull. But for each pull, you should have something pretty big. Your cooldowns span different time frames, so you have your big mitigation, your big 30% mitigation, which is on a slightly longer cooldown at 2 minutes. And then you have your shorter 1 minute cooldowns, you have 90-second cooldowns, and then you have your really short, like 30-second or even 15-second cooldowns. So you can kind of mix and match these. You could use one long one and a combination of all the short ones. But you should have something rolling pretty much at all times throughout the pulls. You can use these short cooldowns like TBN or Heart of Corundum or I'm forgetting. I just said this earlier, but Bloodwetting. You can use that pretty regularly. Some of these you'll even get, 2 uses in a single pull for some of these short specific cooldowns on each of the tanks. TBN is every 15 seconds, so you can be pressing that a couple times every pull if you have the MP for it, which you should be saving. But what I like to do, I usually run in, pop my big cooldown on the first pack, fill in with some of these shorter cooldowns, like Reprisal, Bloodwetting, Equilibrium's every 60 seconds, so you could probably get one of those in every single pull. Because by the time you pull mobs, run to the end of the pack, AoE them down, and get to the next pack, usually a minute has passed if you're going quickly. If you're going slower, it can be longer than a minute, but you kind of play it by ear, see where you're at. Just know to not use all of your cooldowns at once. Try to spread them out over the course of different pulls, but you also want to be using them fairly liberally. Get more uses of them throughout the dungeon. If you find that you're sitting on cooldowns, not using them, you could probably be using them more often than you are. So just press some of those shorter cooldown ones. If it's like a minute, you can use those pretty often. If it's 2 minutes, you get one of those every other pull. Arm's Length is another 2-minute one. So first pull, you could potentially do Vengeance, Arm's Length, 30% with a 20% slow. That's pretty good mitigation. So you would have that for the first pull and potentially the third pull, or it would typically come up on the boss. And then bosses in this, mitigating on bosses is a completely different story. The dungeon packs, the mobs themselves, are typically way more dangerous than the bosses in dungeons. So you want to be using your burst, you want to be using your mitigation on the dungeon mobs. You obviously want to be bursting the bosses as well when they come up, but you don't really need to mitigate them quite as much on the bosses, that is. You want to be using Reprisal and your party mitigation for the raid-wide unavoidable damage that the bosses will do. We'll get to that a little later on when we talk about raiding as well, but and then you can use some other things like Nascent Flash here on Warrior. You can give Oblation to party members. You can give TBN to party members. Things that, like, if you see one of your DPS or the healer who's about to stand in an AoE, you can always throw them a heal or a shield. That's really good to do and get in the habit of doing as well. For the bosses, you obviously don't need to be doing that for the dungeon pulls because you'll have aggro on everything if they're standing and stuff. That's their problem. But mitigation is, a bit of an art form that takes some practice. But if you really focus on, trying to get as many uses of things as possible and spreading them out in a way that keeps you covered for the most amount of time, your healers will be happy and you will be just doing a good job tanking, because that's one of the key points for dungeon tanking, is just making sure you're mitigated for whatever pull you're doing. If you have no mitigation, don't make a big pull. In a lot of the earlier dungeons, you won't have as much mitigation, so you might not have something for the next pull. In that case, you can just do slightly smaller pull, or, hope that something comes off cooldown in time before you die. It gets a little hairy. I do like to have hyper potions on my hotbar as a tank, so if things are getting a little spicy, I can at least use one of these and heal a little bit. That restored 11,000 HP at level 90. It'll be a little less at lower levels, but I believe it's 25%. Yeah, 25% of your HP, so that could definitely save you in a pinch. But just learning when to weave in all the different mitigations and heals and shields will just come in time. But as long as you're not overlapping too many of them, you should be in a pretty good spot. Another thing that's really similar to what we just talked about with the mitigation timing is actually your burst timing. So all of the tanks at the moment, for the most part, operate on a 1-minute burst. Gunbreaker and Dark Knight do have a button every 2 minutes, but we'll just say that every minute you should be doing your burst. I'm not going to go into the different tank rotations in this video. I'll let you look that up on your own. There are good resources for that. The Balance is a good one that shows all of the rotational guides. And some of that stuff will be changing in Dawntrail in another couple months anyway. So I won't get too detailed there. But you want to be using your burst as close to on cooldown as possible. You want to be getting the most uses of your burst throughout the entire dungeon that you can. You don't want to be holding your burst just for the boss. You want to be bursting on the very first pull, and then every time it comes up. The only time that you don't want to burst on cooldown is if you're already in the middle of a pull and all of the mobs are about to die. And if you were to burst, you would not get the full use out of it. So if they would die before your burst is over, you might want to consider holding it for the next pull or the boss that's coming up. If it's only going to take, 2 or 3 more GCDs to finish off that pack of mobs, just hold your burst. There's no use in only getting, a third of your burst out. It would be better in that case to hold it. But, and when I say on cooldown, I don't literally mean on cooldown. I mean when you're in combat, obviously. So you would use it on the next pull or the next boss if it comes off cooldown between pulls. That should go without saying, but I'll throw that in there just in case. But the more times you can burst in the dungeon, the better. The goal is to get through it as quickly as possible. Maybe not everybody's main goal, but it's fun to do the most damage that you possibly can, and that is done by fitting as many bursts as you can within the entire length of the dungeon, not just on the bosses. So like I said before, the mobs are the scary part. You want to deal with them quickly. And when your burst comes up on a boss, that's just a bonus as well. It'll always line up. So you'll get bursts on mobs as well as the bosses. Just play it smoothly. That's what people are expecting you to do, typically. You can kind of follow what the DPS are doing if you see them put buffs up, if you're familiar with the DPS buffs. If you see, Dancer's tech step go out or Ninja put a mug on a boss, you could potentially play into it, but I've typically found that it's better to do my own thing in dungeons where I am trying to burst as often as possible. And if people aren't doing that, then that's on them. They're the ones not playing optimally at that point if they're holding buffs too long or, delaying them unintentionally. I'm not personally going to wait around for them to use my buffs, so I typically just try to get my burst out as regularly as I possibly can, and that goes a long way in upping your damage in the dungeons as well. So one more real quick tip. Some people get nervous because they don't really know the dungeons, they don't know where to go, they don't know the pulls. If you're new, it's really not a big deal, but one thing that helps, at least helps me navigate dungeons that I might not be super familiar with, is just to simply open your map. You can have your map open at all times, just leave it up on your screen. Before you even go into the dungeon, just position it somewhere comfortable where, it's mostly out of the way and you can see it. But when it's open, I can just run through the entire dungeon with that there and just see where I need to go. There will be little things that the map doesn't tell you, like in this one where you have to come up here and grab a key from this guy. But the map does show these like key points with the red pins on them, so you can kind of get an idea where things might be. This is just something little. A lot of the more modern dungeons are such a straight line corridor anyway that it really is unnecessary to do this. But if it makes you comfortable, just throw your map on screen. This is really good for dungeons as well as PvP. You should be doing this anyway, so get used to this. And playing with your map on screen is just something that I'll sometimes do if I'm a little lost in a dungeon. So this next tip actually is not about tank, it's about healer, and playing into your healer's strengths. So there's really not a whole lot you need to think about as a tank as far as what the healer is doing. The only one that's honestly even worth thinking about or checking for is if you have a white mage, because white mage has this ability called Holy, which is their AOE attack. They'll be using this on any mob pack. And what this does is that it stuns the enemies. So as soon as you stop and start hitting a pack of mobs, the white mage should be using Holy. And you'll see on these, it gives them a stun debuff. Starts out at 4 seconds, 4 or 5. And then it has, it gets incrementally worse over time. This stun will interrupt the mobs as well as do damage. So when you're playing with a white mage specifically, you might want to delay some of your mitigation until this stun effect wears off, because now you can see that these mobs are fully resisting this stun. And at that point, you know, they would start hitting you more. But while they're stunned, they're not going to be hitting you. So a white mage does have the ability to delay that initial damage on the mob packs. None of the other healers really have anything like this at the moment in Endwalker. We'll see in Dawntrail, but it's always good to check to see if you have a white mage. They also have Benediction, which is a full heal. They don't get Holy until level 45, and they don't get Benediction until level 50, so if you're lower level, you don't even have to worry about this. But Benediction's literally a full 100% heal instant cast, so if you see the white mage is letting you get a little low, they might be planning to use that. Just something else to think about. Sometimes that's really good with different invulns. If, you know, a Gunbreaker uses Super Bolide, and then the white mage can invuln it, or can Benediction it right after. That can be really strong. But Holy is just a really powerful tool, and if you burn all of your MIT up front, you might be missing out on the value of both these stuns as well as your MIT, because your MIT might fall off before these stuns do. You'll still get some value because, you know, the mobs are still poking me in between. But overall, just being aware of those holies can really help you plan your mitigation better. And, you know, you can just plan around them, delay your mitigation a little bit. It depends on the white mage getting in there quickly and blasting those out as soon as possible. But again, the other healers don't have a whole lot for you to think about as a tank. They're basically just going to be giving you stuff. You might find that some Astros have a harder time healing you because they just don't have the same output as white mage. They're also just harder to play at the moment. So maybe be a little more careful if you see a Sprout Astro as your healer, but otherwise, white mage, super powerful to help you out in the stun department. Alright, so there's really not much else to be said for dungeons. It's pretty straightforward. You'll figure it out in time. It's really just figuring out when to use your mitigations, how to pull mobs, try to see where you feel like you're struggling, where the healers need to heal you more, and, you know, move around some mitigation, and you'll get there. It just takes time. But we haven't touched on raiding at all when it comes to trials, story bosses, as well as the 8-player raids. There's a bit of a different dynamic. However, if you've done dungeons, if you've tanked dungeons, you should have a pretty easy time with at least the normal difficulty trials and raids. It's really not too different by any means from a dungeon boss. So you can really just hop into those and figure it out. A lot of the time it's even less responsibility because you do have a co-tank, and if they're the main tank, then you don't really have to do a whole lot. You're basically just a glorified DPS at that point. Once you get into extreme and higher difficulty rating, there is absolutely more difficulty and responsibility for the tanks when it comes to different mechanics, positioning, tank swapping, and we'll touch on some of that. But a lot of that really is fight dependent, and once you start getting into those higher difficulties, you'll likely want to be looking into some sort of guide, either a video guide, a written guide, or different toolboxes with diagrams showing the mechanics. And that will explain how all of that works better than I ever could for all the different fights in this game. But if you're just getting into tanking, trials and normal raids are honestly no harder than dungeons for the most part. Some of the random raids throughout time have had slightly more difficult mechanics that you have to figure out. But as a tank, there really aren't too many of them that should cause you too many problems. You might take an extra hit or two here or there, but you're a tank, so you'll probably survive it. And even if you die, your co-tank will be able to pick up the slack. So nothing to really stress about there, but we'll talk a little bit more about raids. All right, I'm in here in another instance, unsynced. I'm level 90 in a level 60 trial. But I just want to talk about a few things in reference with the actual boss here to just give an example. The first thing is main tank versus off tank. Which one should you be? Does it matter which job plays what? A lot of the time you'll see warrior and paladin as the main tank, and the off tanks are more commonly dark knight and gunbreaker, but it really doesn't matter, especially for normal level difficulty stuff. You can do whatever you want, and a lot of the time it's just whoever turns their tank stance on first is basically saying, hey, I'll be the tank. There's really not much more to it than that. There's not much more discussion that needs to be had. As far as prepping to pull the boss, that is always going to be the main tank's job, because the boss will take aggro on whoever pulls it initially. Obviously the tanks have means to take aggro back if somebody else early pulls, but I would typically just throw a ranged attack and then face the boss north. Facing the boss north and away from the party is pretty much the most important thing, and the only thing you really have to worry about when it comes to raiding at a normal difficulty. Because sometimes the bosses will cleave, they will, hit a big conal attack in front of them, and you don't want to face that towards the party at all. So you really just want to have them faced away at all times. Some bosses will kind of spin around on their own free will, detached from whatever you're doing, and sometimes it's better to just face them whatever direction they want to be facing. So like if they keep spinning back to south, sometimes it's better for you as the tank to stand south and just keep them facing one direction so they're not constantly spinning back and forth. That's all very fight dependent and situational, but as a melee who is going for positionals either on the rear of the boss or the sides of the boss at any given time, it can be very useful to just have the boss facing one direction as consistently as possible. So that is something good to consider whenever you are moving and positioning the boss. Just always try to lock it in one direction. That way the rest of the party knows where they can stand. If it's spinning around, everybody's going to have a bad time. People are going to get cleaved. Melee are not going to be happy. Another thing you can do when starting is use the ready check under the party menu. This basically just confirms that everybody in your party's ready. It gives them a yes or no option. And they can just either say, yep, I'm ready, or no, I'm not ready. This is, again, not super necessary in normal duty finder content when you're just queuing up for these fights, but it's something that you can do in higher difficulty stuff, or just to use. It's usually good to see the tanks take charge of this sort of thing. There's also a countdown, so when you want to start the fight, when everybody's ready, again, this is typically not something that's done in normal duty finder content. But if you ever want to try it, you can. You can start a countdown. You can set it as long as you want. You can use usually 10 seconds. If there's a dancer in the party, you can probably do 16 just for one of their cooldowns. It lines up better. You can start that, and it will literally just start a countdown that shows on everybody's screen. Half the time in Duty Finder, people don't even listen to this, and they pull the boss before the countdown even finishes. But in an ideal world, everyone would see this and pull the boss right as the countdown's ending. You take the boss, face it away, and then you just start doing your rotation. Again, I'm level 90 here in a 60 dungeon, but this will die way too fast, so I'm going to stop actually hitting it. And then you just have all the different raid markers that I'm sure you've seen. There are going to be unavoidable party-wide damages like that, which was a party stack. So I could use things like my Divine Veil here to give shields to the whole party. Here he's winding up to punch me, so I would want to use my personal mitigation, because that's a big tank buster. Other tank busters are typically denotated by a big red circle around the tank. But yeah, it's pretty much just mitigate the tank busters for your personal use, and then use reprisal as well as your party mitigation for any raid-wide damage. And if you use your mitigation in here the same way that you do in a dungeon, well, not exactly the same, but if you think about your mitigation like you do in a dungeon and try to really cover all of the big hits that are coming in on you, your healers will be very happy, the rest of your party will live. Again, in normal difficulty content, things really don't take a whole lot of damage, so yeah, there's not a whole lot else to say about raids before we start getting into the more difficult stuff, but we'll sit here and look at Sephiroth's cool transition and then get out of here. Alright, the next thing that I want to talk about is the idea of a tank swap. Now, this is really only required in slightly higher end content, like extremes and higher. It's very common in Savage and Ultimate. Pretty much most of the fights have it. And the idea is that typically a boss will apply a vulnerability to you as the tank. And if you take a big hit while you have that vulnerability, you would die. So the off tank would need to take the boss off of you and tank that big hit. A lot of the time this comes in the form of two different tank busters back to back, where the first one applies a vulnerability, and if you were to get hit by the second one, you would just die instantly. So a lot of the time the main tank will take the first, the second off tank will provoke and take the second, and then they'll just kind of hold the boss, or the main tank will even take it back, depending on the fight. A lot of that stuff is very fight dependent on exactly how it works, but the basics of a tank swap, the off tank can really just provoke the boss as long as they have their stance on, and usually that's enough for them to pull aggro of the boss. To ensure that they hold aggro, because if you still have your stance on, you could potentially rip it back from them if you're doing a lot of damage, and they might not be. So you could turn your tank stance off and shirk them so that it gives 25% of your aggro to them. And with your stance off, you will not be generating more aggro. So that's just kind of the easy way to do a tank swap. Off tank provokes, you turn off your stance and shirk. You can actually set up a macro for shirk, because shirk is a targeted ability, meaning you have to target them in the party list before you press this. But I will flash a macro on screen now where you can just press the macro and it will immediately shirk your co-tank, assuming they are second in your party list. If you have your tank sorted differently, if they're not second in the party list, just change the number in the macro to whatever number spot you have them on your party list and it will work just the same. But that macro is really handy. I personally don't use it because I just like targeting in the party list. I find it fun on controller. But that definitely helps. And tank swaps really aren't hard at all, as long as you know where your provoke button is. I know a lot of new tanks don't, so get used to using provoke. get used to where your shirk is and pay attention to if you have your tank stance on or not, because if you don't have it on and you try to provoke, you might not hold aggro. It might, the boss might turn to you and look at you for a second, but then the main tank might grab it back if they have their stance on. So always pay attention to those three: tank stance, shirk, and provoke whenever you're dealing with tank swaps. Now, there is another thing that I wanted to show in regards to this, and that's just some of the debuffs that are associated with this. These debuffs will all show up in your party list or your debuff bar, depending where you have that in your HUD. It might show up in different spots on your screen, but these debuffs always show in your party list. And as shown here on this menu, the debuffs are the ones with the down arrow, and buffs are the ones with the up arrow. So just something handy to know. And as a tank, a lot of these you don't really need to know. You don't need to know every last debuff, what they all do. The ones to look out for are the resistance down debuffs or vulnerability up. Those are the ones that are going to make you want to tank swap. So like this magic vulnerability up, I believe there's, physical vulnerability up. These are ones where, like, if an ability gives you this debuff, you likely want to tank swap because there's likely a big hit coming up that's going to kill you if you have this. So the off tank wouldn't have this because they weren't getting hit by the boss, and if they swap, then they can take that next big hit. Sometimes these also stack in some of the extremes, so like you'll get a stacking vulnerability, and once this hits anywhere between like 3 to 5, you want to swap. Depending on the fight. Again, when you're doing extreme and higher stuff, you should really be looking up fight-specific guides, because there's too much information in this game, and there's just no way I could tell you how it all works. I wish I could, but I don't know. So definitely look up for whatever fight you're trying to do, as to when to swap for the different vulnerabilities and everything, because it can be a little finicky. But it's really not too bad once you get the timing down. It's just something that you learn as you go along the way. Alright, so there's really not much more to talk about when it comes to raiding. Obviously, the high-end stuff is way out of the scope of this video. I'm not going to teach you how to ultimate raid in this basic beginner guide for tanking. A lot of it's really just fight-specific and learning the mechanics of the different fights. But there is one more thing I wanted to talk about, and that is about keeping uptime when you have to move the boss. So yet again, I'm just in here in a fight by myself, unsynced. I'm level 90, this is a level 70 boss. But I just want to show you how, if you need to move the boss for different mechanics, you can do so while keeping uptime. So in between GCDs, I can kind of pull the boss while keeping my GCD rolling. Sometimes they don't want to move if they're in the middle of a cast, but I'm able to pull the boss around while keeping full uptime. Now, this is good, like there, if he was in the middle of that AOE and I needed to get him out. There's going to be a million different instances of when you'll need to do this, but just being able to keep your GCD rolling while moving a boss, you kind of have to yo-yo a little bit, like go in and out when the boss is moving, and it'll kind of lag behind a little bit and following you, but it's actually very easy to do. It becomes a little bit more difficult when you're trying to weave in all of your other damage abilities. Some of the tanks have it harder than others. For example, like Gunbreaker and having their continuation combo, it becomes quite a bit more difficult, but I was able to keep up full uptime there, even though I went way out. Yeah, it's really not too difficult. Again, just in between GCDs, you can kind of pull it, go back in for a hit, go back out to move it. And this is something that you can practice in dungeons with the dungeon bosses. Nice and tiny now, because I had nobody to stack with. But here you get a little mini example of how to move. So I'm not going to make you sit through this whole boss fight, but that was something that I thought was interesting and very worth it to bring up, because that's way better than just kind of running out here and not being able to hit the boss while he's chasing me. You don't have to do things super quickly most of the time, so you do have time to, get in there, get some hits in as you move them. And that's it. That's really all there is to raiding in this game. Again, a lot of the high-end stuff is super specific. It's just learning fight mechanics. And even learning the normal raids in this game is just learning how all the different mechanics work, how stacks, how spreads work, all the different markers. I'm not going to go over this all in this video because that is pretty straightforward stuff that I think you can learn just by doing it. A lot of it won't kill you, so learning it yourself is probably a good thing. Yeah, so I don't know. Raiding's really fun in this game. Tanking's really fun. Give it a shot if you haven't yet, and I'm gonna just finish up this fight and catch you in the next section. Alright, so we're kind of getting into some of the slightly more advanced stuff that I didn't want to scare away people with at the very start of the video, but this kind of goes back to dungeon tanking, specifically when to use your AoE. It's a little different between the tanks. In most cases, you want to be using your full AoE abilities, your entire AoE combo on 3 or more targets. So the more enemies that you are fighting, the more effective your AoE abilities are, typically. However, Dark Knight and Gunbreaker, it is useful to use your AoE abilities on 2 targets. It is still a gain in DPS over your single target. Whereas Warrior and Paladin, your AoE combo is only a gain on 3 targets. So there's some math that goes into this. You can look at the potencies of the abilities. I personally just go look at the balance. Again, I recommended that earlier. It's just, they have a website, they have a Discord that provide all of the different job guides, rotations, all the math behind the scenes as to why things work the way they do. But Gunbreaker and Dark Knight just end up being a little different due to the math, where you want to use your AoE combo on 2 target, but then once you build up your burst, once you start going into your burst, you don't want to keep AoEing at 2 target. You want to start going into just your single target burst, like your Gnashing Fang combo. You don't want to be using Fated Circle on 2 target. In dungeons, to keep aggro, you can kind of swap back and forth. Again, if you're fighting 2 targets in a dungeon, it's very likely that the pack is mostly dead and there's only 2 left anyway. So this is like a very minor optimization thing, but for all of the tanks, when you're fighting 2 target, you basically just want to be using more of your single target burst abilities, but then on Dark Knight and Gunbreaker, you want to be using your AoE combo GCDs in order to just maximize your damage. It's just a little damage optimization, but like I said, very much worth doing. So another little funny trick that you can do when tanking in dungeons, this isn't super relevant. It only comes up in some of the older dungeons a bit when, you know, you don't have a full toolkit, or when the healers maybe, you know, are struggling to keep up with healing you. I'm not going to hit anything because I'm on synced level 90 in a 47 dungeon. But one thing you can do is pull mobs and line of sight them. So if I get out of line of sight, those ranged mobs aren't able to hit me. That only bought me a couple of seconds until they actually caught up to me. But coming around this corner and hiding behind the wall, they're not able to hit me with their ranged attacks. So that can be really useful for your healers, just to literally buy them a second or two to get another heal off on you. And that can save your life in some of these early dungeons. So if you ever see a corner that you can kind of like dip behind, if you're doing this though, just be careful, because if you line of sight your healer, they're not going to be able to heal you either. So they have to be on the same page. This first pull in Aurum Vale is a pretty common one, where the tank will often run into the boss room and hide behind this wall. You kind of just hug that left side and come right in here as to not pull all of the mobs. I wish things were a little stronger so I could show you. But another thing that you can do if you're really struggling, if your healer is struggling to keep up, is to kind of kite mobs. And what kiting is basically just running around and trying to avoid their auto attacks. Kiting kind of implies like, oh, I'm, you know, running around with a kite in the wind, and the enemies are the kite. So you're kind of just having them trail behind you. I'm gonna kill... that killed everybody. But that's something else you can do. Again, that's like in dire straits in early dungeons where like your healer's struggling to keep you up. You can try to pop sprint and run away from the mobs in like a circle just to try to buy you an extra second or two between auto attacks where your healer might be able to get off an extra heal on you. One more thing that you can try to do that's super not necessary but kind of fun is just really optimizing your sprinting inside of dungeons to try to get through it quickly. This only really works if you're with a good group. I'm going to queue us into a level 80 dungeon unsynced just to show this. Real quick, another fun thing is if you sprint before you queue in, that sprint will carry over. So once I load in, I should have sprint going, but my sprint will also be off cooldown. So I've still got 10 seconds of sprint right now. And I've got another sprint stored up. So that's just something fun little trick. Not super useful when it comes to actually playing the game. But let's see here, now I've got another sprint. It's something you can try to do. I don't think it's going to work very well when you queue into a dungeon and, you know, you have to wait for somebody viewing a cutscene or whatever. But it's fun if you're running stuff unsynced or with friends, maybe. So here we're just kind of showing another dungeon pull. These level 80s are actually a pretty good showcase because I can live a lot of this stuff. I can solo a lot of it. Things don't do too much damage in here unsynced now at the current level. But yeah, I don't know. The sprint optimization is something very niche where between dungeon packs you can try to use sprint at the optimal times just to kind of get to the next pack as quickly as you can, while still carrying your sprint through all the way, like, until you get to the next stopping point, I guess. Again, not something at all that you have to worry about. That little trick at the start was a bit more fun, but here, sprints off cooldown, so I kind of have to think to myself, like, do I want to sprint now, or do I want to sprint when I get closer to the pack to actually have sprint up for the pull? And that comes with, like, dungeon knowledge. I'm going to pop it now. One thing that makes it much easier is if you have a Fizz ranged who can use Peloton. Well, this is actually the last pack, so I guess that sprint optimization didn't matter for anything. But yeah, if you have a Fizz range that can use Peloton, it basically lets you save your sprint until the very last second. Again, this is not a big deal at all. It's just something I have a bit of fun with. And maybe you will too. But again, that little trick at the start that lets you go in with an extra sprint. It's kind of cool. Thought I'd share. So one more thing that I see a lot of new tanks do that seems like it should be, you know, a no-brainer is use their gap closer to pull the boss. A lot of tanks will just immediately dash in and start hitting the boss because you'd think, you know, maybe that's a good idea. But ideally, I mean, those gap closers do damage. So if you can put those under buffs, your party's buffs, they will do more damage. So ideally, you want to be holding those until you see the party buffs go out. Typically, that's a few GCDs into the fight. Usually around 3 or 4 for most jobs, I believe. But if you just pull the boss with a normal ranged attack, or on Paladin, if you pull it with a Holy Spirit, you go in, get your buffs up. Warrior has a personal buff. Then you can start going into your burst. Like once you get that buff up, you can start putting out your gap closers. I got clipped by that. Being too greedy. But it's always a better option. There might be very specific instances where you want to pull with a gap closer, but that's in like super high-end optimization. When you're fitting in an extra use or something in Ultimate or whatever. I'm not super familiar with that stuff, but I know Dark Knight has some goofy stuff with that. But yeah, just, you really don't want to be pulling with your gap closer. Save it for buffs. Once you see those party buffs go out, then you can rip your gap closers and just put that extra bit of damage inside the buffs, and you'll be doing more damage overall. Alright, I think that's about all I've got when it comes to tanking. Like I said, I'm not even a full-time tank. I'm just out here doing some tanking for fun on the side. But, you know, I think I have a pretty good grasp of what I'm doing for the most part. Sometimes I second guess myself when I die in a dungeon or something stupid happens, but it'll happen to the best of us. And if you have better ways to do things, let me know in the comments. If I'm doing everything wrong, please let me know. But I think it's worked out pretty well for me so far. Maybe I'm griefing all my healers. I don't know. But I think it's all right. And I have fun with tanking, so I'm sure you will too if you're new to it. Just jump in there. Don't be afraid to tank some dungeons, tank some raids. I think you should actually maybe start with some raids if you're already familiar with normal trials, normal raids. Jump in there on tank. It's really not any harder. I think dungeons are a little scarier personally, but they're not so bad either. So just give it a shot. Worst that happens is you die and reset and maybe get blacklisted by the healer or something, but yeah, whatever. There's more healers out there. So if you enjoyed this video, I appreciate you for watching it. I appreciate anybody who's liking the videos and subscribing to the channel. Really helps out a lot. It's been super fun making these videos, hanging out with everybody in Discord. If you've got any questions, feel free to join the Discord. It'll be linked down in the description. Lots of cool people have been coming over to hang out lately, and I appreciate everybody for stopping by, saying hi. And yeah, this has just been a lot of fun making these videos and hanging out. So I really am looking forward to doing this moving forward into Dawn Trail. Can't wait to see what's coming for the tanks. Hopefully I don't have to update this video too much. I think this will carry over for a lot of whatever's to come in Dawn Trail. We'll probably just have a few more damage buttons, maybe some extra mitigation. Who knows? We'll see. But I will be sure to keep you all up to date. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.